My name is Oya Zaimolu, and I work on renewables and wastes annual statistics here at the IEA's Energy Data Center. And today I'll walk you through the first of our presentations on the fuels that we collect annual data for. We'll have time for questions at the end, similar to this one, but feel free to also drop them in the chat. Either a colleague will reply during the session or I'll follow up afterwards. So today's presentation is divided into three parts. First, I'll cover key global trends in renewables. Then we'll take a look at some of the core statistical concepts specific to renewables. So in Luca's presentation, you got to see the key concepts for energy overall, but here we'll dive a little bit deeper into renewables specifically. And finally, I'll walk you through the structure of the renewables and wastes questionnaires. But before we dive in, let's start with a quick question. So if you go on menti.com, and I will share the screen in a second for the code, you'll see the question, which renewable energy do you think makes up the largest share of total energy supply worldwide? So if we go on Menti over here, please enter the code 23209082. You may also use the QR code. I see answers are coming in. And I'll give you a couple more seconds before we take a final look at what the answers looked like and what the correct answer is. And just to reiterate, the question was which renewable energy makes up the largest portion in the total energy supply in the world. And so here, oops. If you answered solid biofuels, that was correct. But we see that most of you answered as hydro. And while hydro and solar PV play a large role in total energy supply, it is mainly solid biofuels that is the most commonly used. So let me just switch back to my presentation over here. So as I mentioned, solid biofuels actually plays the largest portion in total renewable energy supply. And here's a little bit of a deeper dive into this. As you can see on the slide, looking at total world energy supply in 2023, renewables comes in fourth place after fossil fuels, making up about 14% of the total here in this chart on the left. The largest part of that is biofuels and waste, as we just saw, which on their own actually account for around 8.5%. So that's more than half of all renewable energy supply. Now, when we think of renewables on its own, the first examples that usually come to mind are electricity sources like solar PV, wind, or hydro. But in reality, the most widely used renewable product globally is still biomass, mainly converted into heat, and it's especially common in the global south, where it's used for cooking and heating. As you can see here, several energy products have grown significantly over the past 3 decades, from the period 1990 up till 2023, especially modern renewables like solar PV and wind. When you think about it, that's quite different from solid biofuels and hydro, which were already widely used back in 1990 and have thus not seen as steep of an increase. And if we look at the total renewables line compared to the total energy supply in gray, so these two bars over here, we see that renewables have grown at a slightly faster pace overall, the 2.2% compared to the 1.7% of growth. And this has largely been driven by supportive policies, particularly for solar and wind that we've seen worldwide in recent years, especially. That said, as we saw earlier, renewables still make up a relatively small share of total energy supply, which means that for renewables to become the main energy source and for the sector to fully decarbonize, they'll need to grow at a much faster rate and pace than total global energy supply overall. Here on this slide, you can see on the chart on the left how renewables fit into total energy supply across different regions in the world. You see over here that Africa stands out with the largest share of almost 43%. And this actually ties back to what I mentioned earlier about solid biofuels in the global south. In Africa and most non-OECD regions, the main renewable product is biomass, often in the traditional use of biomass, that in principle means burning the fuel, often inefficiently and with serious health impacts as well. In OECD countries, biomass plays a smaller role and is generally used in more modern ways, for example, to produce electricity or heat. And even though the overall share of renewables in the OECD is still relatively low, there's been strong growth in recent years, especially for electricity generation. And the share remains modest largely because energy-intensive sectors like transport are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And if we take a look at the chart on the right over here in the pie chart, the green slice again mostly reflects traditional biomass use in the residential and commercial public services sectors. The slice for electricity plants is the one that we want to see grow, since electrifying end-use sectors with renewable electricity, particularly from modern renewables without combustion, is what we should pursue to expand. And this brings me to the last slide of this first section, which shows world electricity production. In 2023, renewables made up about 30% of total generation, and this is increasing even more in more recent years. And this is just a gentle increase up from 29% in 2022, which it is equivalent to about an increase of 835 terawatt hours. Within renewables, hydro remains the most widespread source of electricity, but in recent years, solar PV and wind have seen the fastest growth. The rapid growth is exciting, but it's also challenging in new ways, especially for grid management. Because they're intermittent sources, the generation doesn't always line up with demand, and at times they can be quite unpredictable and thus must be managed well. So moving into the second part of the presentation, key concepts. Renewable products are grouped into 4 categories, and this classification is based on the primary form of energy we consider from a statistical perspective and how that energy can be converted into other forms. For non-combustible sources, in this first category here, we look at the first energy form that can be practically used. For example, in this group, electricity-only sources, think of wind or hydro, are some examples of that. The energy from wind or from flowing water first creates mechanical energy by forcing the rotation of turbines, but in almost all cases, that mechanical energy is converted directly into electricity. So electricity is what we classify here as the primary form. And the second group is heat. Here, heat can be used directly, for instance, through solar thermal collectors, heating water in households as consumption in the residential sector, or it can be used to generate electricity like in geothermal power plants. Later this week, in other presentations, you'll see how primary energy is calculated for geothermal and solar thermal, and how efficiency differs depending on whether the output is heat or electricity. The third group is combustible fuels. Unlike the others, we do not need to define their primary form as they can be directly quantified. And importantly, they're the only renewable sources that can be stored and used later. The fourth group is also heat, but here we're talking about heat extracted from the environment with heat pumps as ambient heat. And in this case, it cannot be converted into electricity, so it's kept as its own separate category. And here you can see the classification of solid biofuels, the definition of which is here at the center of this slide. And all of these different types of solid biofuels or biofuels are considered primary products, except for charcoal, which you can see here in blue, as it is derived from the carbonization of wood. Within these, there are some products that require specific explanations, and one of them is black liquor. It is a byproduct of the paper manufacturing process, and even though it's technically a liquid, it's classified with solid biofuels because it comes from wood, and its composition and use are closer to solids than to conventional liquid biofuels. And another example is industrial waste. Over here, as you can see on the bottom right corner, which is typically solid organic matter and is considered within solid biofuels. And the most common product is natural rubber components of waste tires. So solid biofuels can be a little tricky to classify, and if you're unsure whether a product should be classified as a solid biofuel or as industrial waste, just reach out to us and we can work it out together. This slide shows how liquid biofuels are reported in the renewables questionnaire compared with the oil questionnaire. And this is an important one. In the renewables questionnaire, we only report pure liquid biofuels. That means you do not need to include the portion of biofuels that are already blended with oil products. We only report pure liquid biofuels here, and blended quantities are reported in the oil questionnaire. Here in the slide, you can see an example of a country that produces 1,000 kilotons of diesel containing 10% biodiesel. Half is exported and half is used in road transport. In production, diesel and biodiesel are produced separately before blending. So the 100 kilotons of pure biodiesel, which is first produced and then blended, is the one that should be reported in the renewables questionnaire and not in the oil questionnaire. But once the products are blended, the flows, trade, and final consumption are reported only in the oil questionnaire, both for the diesel and the biodiesel fraction within it. Back in the renewables questionnaire, after reporting production, you also show the 100 kilotons under the transformation sector in the flow blended with oil products, which indicates how the pure biodiesel was used. In this way, pure liquid biofuels are traced into blended products. And to keep in mind, the same principle applies to biogases as well when they're blended with natural gas in the grid. Now let's take a look at the data sources that we have and the types of data collection. On the supply side, data usually comes from energy producers, importers, and exporters, and here there tend to be fewer players to track. However, on the demand side, information can come from households, enterprises, and other consumers, which makes it a little bit more complex. And data can be collected through surveys, through administrative records, or often through a mix of both. In practice, most countries use an integrated approach, combining these different methods and filling in gaps with estimations to capture all of the necessary values for every energy product and flow. And let's take a closer look at the different types of data collection. Surveys are often the best source since you're collecting exactly what you need, like enterprises reporting the amounts of fuel they use in their industrial processes, etc. But surveys are also time consuming and they can be expensive, which makes it hard to run them every year. And so a common approach is to conduct a survey every 2 or 3 years and then make estimations for the years in between. Administrative data, on the other hand, are collected for non-statistical purposes, usually by government bodies to meet legislations, policies, or regulations. And because of that, we need to be careful. Product definitions may not align perfectly, and administrators may not always have the statistical expertise, which can lead to inconsistencies. So we need to err on the side of caution with this one a little bit. And we can also use measured data. For example, a distribution system operator might have records on solar PV generation in the residential sector. And finally, when no direct data sources are available, we rely on estimations. Typical case of estimations for renewables is solar PV. If you only have information on capacity, for example, on installed capacity, you can estimate generation by applying a capacity factor depending on the various parameters. And before we move into the final part of the presentation, which will be on the structure of the questionnaire, here's a quick look at the different data products that are published by the International Energy Agency, which are supported by the data collected here at the Energy Data Center. Many of these products are freely available, so I'll leave you to explore them further using the links provided on the slide in your own time and at your own pace. Now, the questionnaire is the tool that we use to gather all of the data that you've collected, validated, and sometimes estimated so that we can have a complete picture of the different fuels in a category. And in this case, we're looking at renewables and wastes. For countries that don't submit questionnaires, this still serves as a good example of how we operate. It's the tool we use, the products and the flows we cover, and the way that the data is collected, which may be helpful to you as well. We also apply validation checks directly through the questionnaires. So it's a useful exercise to take a look at the tables that make them up and the methodology that goes on within them. The first table used is to report gross electricity and heat production. Some of these data are also covered in the electricity and heat questionnaire, but here they pertain specifically to renewables products. And the table has two sections: gross electricity production reported in gigawatt hours and gross heat production reported in terajoules. Producers are classified into two main categories: main activity producers, where the primary business is producing energy, and auto producers, whose main business is something else, but who generate energy to support their operations. Each of these groups is then broken down further into electricity-only plants, combined heat and power plants, CHP, and heat-only plants. For heat reporting, all heat production from main activity producer plants should be reported, but in the case of auto producers, you only report the heat that's sold to third parties. And these reporting conventions will also become a bit clearer in the dedicated electricity session later on this week, where they're explained in a little bit more detail. And here you can see table 2A, the largest table in the questionnaire. It lists all of the products across the top and all of the 60 flows down the side. So each column effectively represents the commodity balance for one product. For the definitions of energy products, we follow the International Recommendations on Energy Statistics, IRIS, which you may remember from my colleague Luca's presentation before this, where he explained it in the realm of key concepts of energy statistics. Most products are reported in terajoules on a net calorific basis, except for charcoal and liquid biofuels, which are reported in kilotons. Looking at the rows, the table is broken down into supply, the transformation sector, the energy sector, and then final energy consumption. Final consumption is divided into industry, transport, and other sectors, which covers areas like residential and agriculture. And then there is also final non-energy consumption. For both the energy sector and final consumption, the flows should be reported following ISIC, which was also mentioned in Luca's presentations on key energy statistics before this. So if you're unsure where it should go, we recommend you consult either IRIS or ISIC for further guidelines. Now let's take a look at table 3A. This table has 5 parts and focuses on capacities and more broadly, the technical characteristics of installations. And the idea is that this information can also be used to cross-check the data that you've entered in other tables. The first part collects data on the net maximum electrical capacity of renewable plants. That's the maximum available capacity for generating electricity delivered to the grid, net of what's used to power the plant's own auxiliary components. If you've reported electricity generation in table 1, then you should also report capacity here by type and size in megawatts. Next, up here, you see solar collector surface area reported in thousands of square meters. And just to clarify, this does not include solar PV panels or solar thermal power collectors like CSP, which stands for concentrating solar power. It's only about solar thermal collectors, typically used in the residential sector to heat water. Then we have the production capacity of liquid biofuels reported in kilotons per year. And finally, the table asks for the average net calorific value and density of the different liquid biofuels and charcoal. There's also something specific for solar PV in Table 3A, which we started collecting 2 cycles ago. And as you know, a typical solar PV system has 2 main parts: the panels, which generate electricity in direct current, so in DC, and the inverter, which converts that into alternating current AC. So each plant has both a DC capacity for the panels and an AC capacity for the inverter. Now, for design reasons and to maximize the return on investment of these panels, DC capacity can be typically 20 to 30%, sometimes even up to 50% higher than the inverter's AC power rating. And that's why we ask you to report both capacities for solar PV plants. It helps clarify the situation for this key products in this renewables questionnaire, and it's usually pretty tricky to deal with. And if both the figures are not available, it's important that you at least specify to us which one you're reporting, whether it's AC or DC. In the next table, Table 4, gives a detailed breakdown of the production of solid biofuels and biogases. For solid biofuels, for example, production is split into categories like fuel wood, black liquor, bagasse, animal waste, other vegetal materials and residues, and the renewable portion of industrial waste. All of these figures should be reported in terajoules. And the key concept to highlight here is that the total production of solid biofuels in Table 4 should match the figure reported under indigenous production of solid biofuels in Table 2. So this total that you see here at the top for all of the solid biofuels should match what you reported for solid biofuels in Table 2. And the same principle applies for biogases as well, where you see the total production of biogases here in this table to be equal to the production reported in Table 2 for biogases. Here you can see Table 5, which covers imports by country of origin, and Table 6, which covers exports by country of destination. At the moment, these tables focus on liquid biofuels and wood pellets, since they're the most widely traded renewable commodities, but this could be expanded in the future as trade patterns evolve. And finally, again, last cycle, we introduced Table 7, where we collect non-energy use of renewable products. We still collect this data, and in this year's questionnaire, they're no longer under Table 7, but they're calculated as energy sector, non-energy use in Table 2. Now, in terms of flows, the structure is a mirror of the energy sector and final consumption sectors for energy uses, and it's good to clarify the boundaries of this collection. Only renewables used to replace fossil fuels in final non-energy consumption and that have ceased to be used as substituted by renewables products should be reported in the scope of energy statistics in this table. So if fossil fuels were reported in previous cycles in final non-energy consumption and now have ceased to be used because it's substituted by renewables, they should be reported here, as it was also mentioned in the presentation before this regarding the non-energy use of products. Some examples of this to help clarify the situation are non-energy use of gaseous biofuels replacing natural gas as feedstocks, or liquid biofuels replacing naphtha, LPG, or lubricants in the chemical and petrochemical sectors, as well as solid biofuels used to replace coal products in the industry sector to produce dyes or fungicides. So it has to be clear that certain non-energy use of renewables are still irrelevant to energy statistics. For example, solid biofuels used in furniture or as construction material, or alcohols used in the food sector, food industry should be left outside the scope and not reported here. And here you can see a schematic overview of how the renewables questionnaire connects with the other annual questionnaires, and the strongest link is with the electricity and heat questionnaire. For example, the gross electricity and heat production reported in Table 1 of the Renewables questionnaire should line up with the same products reported in the electricity and heat questionnaire. We also saw the link with the oil questionnaire. In the case of pure renewables blended with fossil fuels, these are reported as indigenous production and blended with fossil fuels in the renewables questionnaire and as receipts from renewables in the oil questionnaire. So as you can see, we have many crosslinks between tables, and we use them to validate the data that you submit to us across different questionnaires. And here are a few links specific to renewables that might be resourceful to you, and I will let you explore them in your own time when we share the presentations. Here are our email addresses. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions later on. And I thank you all for your attention so far. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. I'd be happy to take on any questions that you might have.